I have spent most of my life performing in front of people, yet writing this is probably one of the most vulnerable things I have ever done. I should probably begin by saying that I am a fairly well-known actress in my country. I won't say where exactly because for now I would prefer to remain anonymous. The point of writing this isn't attention, sympathy, or revenge. I'm writing because recently my ex-husband gave an interview where he spoke about the end of our marriage in a way that was so dishonest, so carefully twisted in his favor, that for the first time in years I felt the need to finally tell my own story. Not to expose him, not even to defend myself entirely, but because I know there are women who slowly disappear inside love the same way I once did, and maybe my story will resonate with someone. So I'll start at the beginning. I was one of those children who seemed physically incapable of staying away from a stage. School performances, holiday concerts, local festivals, amateur theater productions. If there was an audience somewhere, I wanted to be there. I grew up in a relatively small town, the kind of place where everyone knows each other, and where community events become a huge part of your childhood. By the time I entered my teenage years, I had already become deeply involved in the creative life of my town. I sang. I danced. I performed in small theater productions. I participated in competitions. And if I'm being completely honest, singing was always my greatest love. When the time came to choose a university, music was supposed to be my future. I was certain of it. I remember researching programs, imagining myself pursuing vocal performance professionally, seeing my life unfolding in that direction. And yet life has strange ways of redirecting us. To this day, I genuinely don't remember exactly how it happened. There was no grand epiphany, no dramatic decision. Somewhere during the admissions process, somehow, unexpectedly, I ended up applying for acting school instead. And I got in. Looking back now, I think it was fate. Because almost immediately I understood I had found the thing I was meant to do. The training was brutal in the best possible way. Endless rehearsals, voice work, stage movement. Learning how to inhabit someone else's emotions so completely that their reality becomes your own. But unlike many of my classmates who struggled with the pressure, I thrived. I loved every second of it. And things happened fast for me. Very fast. By my first or second year, honestly I barely remember exactly which, I had already started performing professionally in theater productions. Soon after that I began getting invited to do voice work, animated films, dubbed movies, television productions. Small roles at first, of course, but enough for people in the industry to begin recognizing my name. I had talent, yes, but more importantly, I had obsession. I worked constantly. I was hungry for every opportunity, and it paid off. By my late 20s, I had built a career many actors spend their entire lives chasing. Theater directors trusted me. Film producers knew my work. Audiences began recognizing me in public. It felt surreal. I had become successful doing something I genuinely loved. But life, as I would later learn, has a way of forcing you to choose what parts of yourself survive. By the time I met the man who would later become my second husband, I had already lived an entire life before him. I had been married once before. I had a child from that marriage. And after the divorce, I honestly believed romantic love had become something secondary in my life. I was focused on raising my child, focused on work, focused on stability. Then I met him. Ironically, on set. He was also an actor. We were filming a project together, and from the very beginning the chemistry between us was impossible to ignore. I know people romanticize relationships formed in artistic professions, but ours genuinely felt extraordinary. It was immediate, intense, warm. The kind of connection where conversation flows effortlessly for hours, and you suddenly realize someone understands parts of you that even you don't fully understand. I fell hard. And he did too. At least I believed he did. What made me love him even more was the way he accepted my child without hesitation. Not performatively. Not carefully. Not because he wanted to impress me. He genuinely stepped into that role naturally. Over time my child began calling him Dad. And seeing that changed something inside me. For the first time after my divorce, I stopped seeing myself primarily as a woman rebuilding her life and started allowing myself to imagine something permanent again. A family, security, partnership, a future. We built a beautiful relationship. I won't rewrite history simply because things ended badly. What we had was real. We loved each other deeply, passionately. There was friendship, laughter, emotional intimacy. And I think this next part is where I slowly began making mistakes I wouldn't recognize until many years later. I have always loved intensely, maybe too intensely. My way of loving has always been complete immersion. When I love someone, I do not love halfway. I pour everything into them. Their happiness becomes my happiness. Their dreams begin feeling as important as my own. And gradually, without consciously realizing it, I stopped being primarily an actress who happened to be married. I became a wife who happened to be an actress. At the time, I thought that was beautiful. I thought sacrifice was proof of devotion. I thought putting someone else first meant I was building something meaningful. I had no idea I was quietly teaching myself to disappear. And strangely enough, while I was shrinking certain parts of myself, he was beginning to grow. Professionally especially. His career started accelerating in ways mine no longer was. And the truth is, I was proud of him. Truly proud. I celebrated every success as if it were my own. I had no way of knowing then that years later, I would look back at this exact period and realize I had spent a decade watering someone else's garden while allowing my own to slowly die. For a long time, I believed we were one of those rare couples who had somehow figured marriage out. People often assume relationships between actors are unstable by nature. Too much ego. Too much competition. Too many opportunities for temptation. Too much time spent living emotionally exposed lives around other attractive, talented people. But strangely, I never felt that about us. In fact, I believed the opposite. Because we understood each other in ways most couples couldn't. We both knew what it meant to work exhausting schedules. We understood the emotional intensity that comes with performing. We understood rejection, criticism, insecurity, the strange vulnerability that comes with constantly placing yourself in front of audiences and asking strangers to judge whether you are enough. There was never jealousy between us professionally. At least not from my side. If anything, I admired watching him evolve. Around that time, my own career had reached a point where I no longer needed to fight for recognition. I had established myself. Directors knew what I was capable of. Theater had become my second home. Although honestly, calling it a second home would be inaccurate. It was my first home. I have worked in film. I still do. I have done voice acting for animation, dubbing for foreign productions, television roles, feature films. And I appreciate all of it. But theater is different. Cinema captures moments. Theater creates them live. Every performance is born and dies in front of you in real time. No second takes. No editing. No corrections. Just pure emotion exchanged between performer and audience. I have always loved that intimacy. I still do. Even now, after everything. But over time, something subtle started happening in my life. I stopped chasing ambition the way I once had. Not consciously. There was no moment where I sat down and decided, I no longer want to prioritize my career. It happened gradually. One compromise at a time. One declined project. One postponed opportunity. One small sacrifice that seemed insignificant individually but massive when accumulated over years. I had become deeply invested in our marriage. In his growth. I think many women will understand what I mean when I say this. Sometimes you don't notice you are disappearing because you convince yourself that loving someone fully is noble. You think supporting someone else's dreams somehow means your own dreams can wait indefinitely. And I let mine wait. He meanwhile was thriving. He began receiving bigger projects, more recognition, larger productions. Then eventually came the opportunity that changed the direction of his entire career. He was offered a major role abroad. A huge international production. First, the plan was temporary. Few months. We celebrated together when he got the offer. I remember being genuinely excited. I felt proud watching his face when he found out. Felt like our success. But filmmaking is unpredictable. Schedules changed. Production expanded. What was supposed to be several months slowly became much longer. Then longer again. Eventually, we found ourselves living in separate countries for extended periods of time. And that became our normal. I stayed home. I continued working in theater. Occasionally film projects. Voice work. Interviews. Events. But increasingly, my life started revolving around waiting. Waiting for him to visit. Waiting for calls. waiting for his schedule to free up, waiting for our real life together to resume. And despite the distance, I never once believed our marriage was weakening. In fact, strangely enough, I thought we were handling the distance remarkably well. We spoke constantly. Long phone calls, messages throughout the day, late-night conversations despite time differences. The same affection, the same warmth, the same emotional intimacy. At least from my perspective, I truly believed we had preserved what made us special. Meanwhile, another battle had entered our marriage. Something far more difficult than distance. Children. More specifically, our inability to have one together naturally. I was no longer a young woman. By then I was already in my 50s. And although I already had a child from my first marriage, we desperately wanted a child together. Or perhaps more honestly, I desperately wanted to give us that experience. So we began IVF treatment. I do not think people fully understand what repeated fertility treatments do to a woman's body, unless they experience it personally. People reduce it to medical procedures, hormones, appointments, clinical language. But living through it is entirely different. Your body stops feeling like your own. You become exhausted in ways sleep cannot repair. Your emotions stop behaving normally. Your appearance changes. Your energy disappears. Your confidence begins eroding piece by piece. I went through 5 attempts. 5. Each failure carrying its own quiet grief. And every time I recovered just enough to convince myself I could endure another round. Because hope is a dangerous thing, especially when motherhood is involved. The physical consequences were brutal. I gained weight rapidly. My skin changed. I constantly felt swollen, exhausted, weak. I barely recognized myself some days. And this part affected me more deeply than I admitted at the time. Because acting is a profession where appearance unfortunately matters. Not always. Not entirely. But enough. Suddenly I no longer felt comfortable auditioning for certain projects. I began declining offers. Sometimes because I physically did not feel well enough to work. Sometimes because emotionally I couldn't bear the idea of being seen. I stopped feeling beautiful. Stopped feeling desirable. Stopped feeling confident in front of cameras. There were projects I should have accepted but didn't. Roles I turned down because I convinced myself I no longer looked the way I was supposed to. I retreated. Quietly. Without drama. Without complaint. And through all of this, I kept prioritizing our marriage. I kept telling myself this was temporary. That once we finally had our child, everything would settle. That once his filming abroad ended, our life together would return. That once this difficult chapter passed, I would rebuild the parts of myself I had neglected. Career, confidence, identity, my body, my ambitions. I kept postponing my own life while investing every ounce of energy into preserving what I believed was our future. And looking back now, this is the part of my story that hurts more than the betrayal itself. Not because of what he eventually did, but because I slowly abandoned myself long before I knew I had been abandoned by him. I had become a woman who was no longer asking, "What do I want?" Instead, I had begun asking only, "What does this marriage need from me next?" And I kept giving, and giving, and giving, completely unaware that somewhere far away in another country, the man I had built my life around was already becoming someone I no longer knew. There is something uniquely cruel about betrayal when it comes from the one person you never allowed yourself to doubt. I've thought about that a lot over the past year. People often ask questions after infidelity becomes public. Did you suspect something? Were there warning signs? Did your intuition tell you? And the honest answer is no. Not even once. I know people romanticize intuition as if women possess some magical ability to sense betrayal before it happens. I didn't. Or maybe I simply trusted too deeply to allow suspicion space inside my mind. Even with the distance. Even with months apart. Even with his increasingly chaotic filming schedule abroad. I believed him. Completely. And perhaps that is why what happened next shattered me so violently. It was around a year ago when I learned the truth. I will not explain exactly how I found out because certain details involve people who never asked to be part of this story. But the truth arrived suddenly. Brutally. Without warning. The kind of truth that divides your life into 2 timelines. The woman you were before knowing. and the woman forced to exist afterward. He was having an affair. Not a flirtation. Not a momentary lapse in judgment. Not some isolated drunken mistake. A real relationship. An ongoing betrayal. And here is the detail that felt almost absurd in its cruelty. The woman had the same name as me. I remember fixating on that detail irrationally. Out of everything I learned, that specific fact disturbed me most at first. It felt surreal. Like life was mocking me. As if replacing me had become so easy. He hadn't even needed to learn saying another woman's name. And the truth became uglier the more I learned. She had been involved with him before. Years earlier. Though back then technically he had been her affair partner. She herself was married. I remember sitting there piecing together timelines in my head, realizing this wasn't some unexpected mistake that happened while we were living apart. This connection had existed before. Long before I knew. Long before I thought our marriage had become this beautiful, secure thing I was protecting. I think people imagine discovering betrayal creates immediate rage. For me, strangely, it didn't. At least not initially. It was physical first. I couldn't breathe properly. My chest felt heavy. I remember staring at walls for long periods of time, unable to think coherently. The strangest part was this overwhelming sense of humiliation. Not anger. Humiliation. Because I had structured my entire life around protecting what I believed was a deeply loving marriage. And apparently I had been the only one doing that. But life had one final twist waiting for me. Something so absurdly complicated that even now I sometimes struggle believing it happened exactly this way. After 5 failed IVF attempts, after years of procedures, hormone injections, disappointment, physical exhaustion, emotional devastation, I decided to try one final time. The 6th attempt. I remember going into it with almost no hope left. I had already emotionally prepared myself for failure. And somehow, against all expectations, it worked. I became pregnant. At 54 years old. A pregnancy I had spent years fighting for. I should have been living the happiest chapter of my life. Instead, I was entering motherhood while simultaneously watching my marriage collapse around me. By then we were already living separately emotionally, even before officially separating physically. He knew I knew. The conversations were devastating. I won't share private details. Some things remain too painful. But what hurt me most wasn't even the affair itself. It was how quickly I realized he had emotionally left our marriage long before I discovered it. While I was putting my body through repeated IVF cycles, he was building intimacy elsewhere. While I was declining career opportunities because I felt physically destroyed from treatment, he was building another life. While I was sacrificing my confidence, health, appearance, and professional momentum for the future I thought we were building, he had already begun replacing me. I remember standing in front of the mirror one evening during pregnancy looking at myself and feeling completely disconnected from the woman staring back. I looked exhausted, older, softer, fragile. I remember thinking, of course he left. And that thought terrified me. Not because I believed it intellectually, but because betrayal had managed to poison the way I saw myself. Suddenly every sacrifice I had made felt grotesque. I had convinced myself for years that love meant endless giving. And now I was standing there realizing I had been rewarding someone who ultimately valued convenience over loyalty. For several weeks after everything exploded, I stopped functioning normally. Not dramatically. I wasn't crying endlessly. I wasn't screaming. I simply shut down. I had absolutely no desire to work. No interest in scripts. No interest in rehearsals. No interest in returning calls. No desire to see colleagues. No desire to be visible. And for someone whose entire identity had always revolved around creative work, that frightened me. Because heartbreak is painful. But losing connection with the work you love, that is terrifying. And then something changed. Not suddenly, but clearly enough that I still remember the moment. I realized I refused to grieve endlessly for a man who had made his choices consciously. I refused to collapse over someone capable of watching me sacrifice years of myself while secretly betraying me. I refused to spend the second half of my life drowning in self-pity over a man who clearly had not spent much time worrying about destroying me. And strangely, the moment I stopped centering his betrayal, I began noticing something unexpected. I had been free for years. I simply hadn't understood it, because the marriage had slowly taught me to define myself through someone else. And suddenly, for the first time in over a decade, I was forced to look directly at myself again. Not as a wife, not as half of a partnership, not as someone supporting another person's dreams. Just me. And I realized something uncomfortable. I had become a woman living far below her own potential. Not because I lacked talent, not because I lacked ambition, but because somewhere along the way I had unconsciously accepted becoming secondary in my own life. And oddly enough, his betrayal became the thing that forced me awake. The pain remained. Of course it did. I was pregnant, alone, publicly humiliated, emotionally exhausted. But underneath all of that, something new had started growing inside me. And no, I'm not talking about the baby. I'm talking about self-respect, the kind I had neglected for years. For the first time in a decade, I stopped asking myself how to save a marriage, and started asking something far more important. Who exactly am I? When I stopped living for someone else. And that question changed everything. I gave birth recently, and I think becoming a mother again at this stage of my life has altered the way I understand nearly everything. People often speak about motherhood as if it is purely softness, tenderness, nurturing, unconditional love. And yes, it is all of those things. But what nobody prepared me for was how deeply becoming responsible for another life can sharpen your understanding of your own. There is something profoundly clarifying about holding a child in your arms while simultaneously standing at one of the most emotionally complicated crossroads of your life. By the time I gave birth, I had already fully accepted that my marriage was over. Not in theory. Not in some temporary separation phase. Over. 10 years. An entire decade of shared life. A decade I had once believed represented the safest emotional home I had ever known. And yet, strangely enough, I did not feel destroyed anymore. That surprised me. I expected bitterness. I expected grief so heavy I would struggle carrying it. Instead, what I mostly felt was clarity. Sometimes life has cruel ways of forcing perspective upon us. And I think I needed this. Not the betrayal itself. I would never say I am grateful for pain. But I needed the awakening that followed. Because I had spent years abandoning myself so gradually that I never noticed it happening. And suddenly I could see everything. I saw how often I had chosen being available for my husband instead of being available for my own ambitions. I saw how many projects I declined because preserving family stability felt more important than nurturing my own professional momentum. I saw how often I minimized my own success because I genuinely believed partnership meant celebrating his victories louder than my own. And perhaps most painfully, I saw how little I had been valuing myself. People sometimes assume betrayal destroys self-esteem. For me, strangely enough, I rebuilt it. Because once the initial pain passed, I was forced to ask difficult questions. Why had I become so comfortable living as supporting cast in my own life? Why had I allowed marriage to become my primary identity? Why had I unconsciously accepted the idea that my purpose was maintaining someone else's comfort, while postponing parts of myself indefinitely? And suddenly I stopped seeing what happened as tragedy. I began seeing it as interruption. A violent interruption, certainly, but an interruption that forced me to finally return to myself. Around that time, something unexpected happened. I reconnected with an old part of myself I had neglected for decades. Music. I mentioned earlier that before acting, singing had always been my first love. In many ways, acting happened accidentally. I stayed because I fell deeply in love with the craft. And I still love it. Very much. I continue acting now. I continue working in film. I continue doing voice work. I continue performing. And I suspect I always will. But after everything happened, I realized something very simple. I am 54 years old. And for the first time in a very long time, I stopped asking permission from life. I realized I do not need to justify wanting more. I do not need to quietly accept that certain dreams belong only to younger people. And I certainly do not need another person validating my worth before pursuing something that makes me feel alive. So I decided I am beginning a new chapter. I am pursuing singing professionally, not as fantasy, not as hobby, as a real career path. Some people hear my age and immediately assume limitations. I don't. Because I think one of the greatest lies society teaches women is that reinvention belongs to youth. Doesn't. I feel more confident now than I did 20 years ago. More aware. More emotionally intelligent. More grounded. And perhaps for the first time in my adult life, I genuinely understand my own value independent of anyone loving me. And of course, I have not abandoned acting. Never. Theater remains my greatest love. Always. There is nowhere I feel more alive than backstage moments before walking in front of a live audience. Film is wonderful. I respect cinema immensely. But theater feels sacred to me. Theater breathes. It exists only in the present. No cameras separating you from emotion. No edits. No second takes. Just truth unfolding in real time. And I think after everything I have experienced recently, truth has become very important to me. Which brings me back to why I decided to write this at all. Recently, my former husband gave an interview. I won't repeat what he said. Frankly, I have no desire to dedicate more energy to correcting every lie he chooses to tell publicly. But I listened. And for a brief moment I felt anger returning. Not because I miss him. I don't. Not because I wanted revenge. I don't. But because I realized he was attempting to rewrite our story. And I refused to allow that. I refused to let years of devotion be reframed as something convenient for someone else's narrative. I know who I was in that marriage. I know how deeply I loved. I know how much I sacrificed. I know how hard I fought for us. And I know I did so sincerely. I carry no shame for loving fully. The shame belongs elsewhere. Today I look at my life differently. I am raising a newborn. I am rebuilding parts of my career I neglected. I am stepping deeper into music. I continue acting. I continue performing in theater. I continue lending my voice to stories in film and animation. And lately, I have started thinking about writing a book. Because I have lived enough life now to understand something important. Pain does not automatically destroy you. Sometimes pain simply introduces you to the version of yourself you were supposed to become all along. If someone had asked me a year ago who I was, I would have answered, a wife, an actress, a mother. Today my answer sounds different. I am a woman who finally understands that loving others should never require abandoning yourself. And strangely enough, I do not hate the woman I was before all of this. She loved honestly. She believed deeply. She gave everything she had. There is dignity in that. But I am far more excited about the woman I am becoming now. Because for the first time in years, I belong to myself again. And if there is one thing I hope someone reading this takes away from my story, it is this. It is never too late. Not too late to begin again. Not too late to reclaim ambition. Not too late to rebuild confidence. Not too late to discover entirely new parts of yourself. Not too late to stop centering people who stop valuing you. And absolutely, never too late to start over. 54 I thought my life was collapsing. Now I understand something better. It wasn't collapsing. It was making room. For me. Finally.